Hi students, this video goes over the final exam for Lit 210 and looks at the example answers that are provided on Blackboard as well. Hopefully you have started your final exam before we hit the last week of the semester, but this video will kind of reinforce the requirements and also help you look at formatting. Just a reminder, this exam is a big deal. It is worth 15% of your final grade. There are 3 different sections for the exam, and for each section you have a different number of questions to answer, so pay attention to those section requirements. The example that we'll look at in a little bit only answers one of those questions just to provide that example. Please be sure that you are supporting your answers with evidence from the texts and that you are citing any additional sources that you use. This includes information provided by the textbooks editor as well as materials from the Blackboard course. The exam reminds you to save your work as you go and not to upload your document to Blackboard until it is completed. If you have some questions about whether an answer you have is correct or complete enough, please do not upload those to Blackboard. Please email me with your questions. So let's look at the requirements for the first part of the exam. The first part, you are asked to define 3 of the following genres of literature and provide 1 or more short story examples of the style that we have read this far in the semester. And this far in the semester is the entire semester. And so you will choose 3 of these genres from this list and talk about examples, how the story illustrates that chosen genre, what are kind of the defining qualities of that genre. Again, you want to make sure that you talk about 3 different genres. So let's look at an example of part 1 from the sample exam. Now again, you are required to answer, to discuss 3 different genres. This example only discusses 1 genre, and if you will look at the list of genres, you will note that fantasy was not one of the genres we discussed this semester. So this is an example, can't copy it, use it. Notice that there are a couple different citations going on in here. So this student pulled from the Encyclopedia of Fantasy. If we had taken fantasy as a genre, that is an encyclopedia that is provided as a course, through the course rather, as a link through the course. Also notice that there are citations with my last name in those. Those are the Blackboard course material. For a nice complete definition of the genre, this student kind of started with the characteristics, the qualities of that genre, and then moved into kind of like where it is situated historically. And the student did that, I believe the student is Samwise Gamgee, so he did this in 2 separate paragraphs. You could probably do this in 1 if you wanted to, but the student wanted to be really thorough with the answer. It also helps you to kind of condense your definition of a genre if you think about what you want to discuss regarding the example stories. So this student, you can kind of see, talks about the worlds that are created by the author and could never really exist, and that the characters, even if they are not human, are easy to identify by their human characteristics. Okay, so we're kind of expecting to hear that. As readers of the answer of this question, we're kind of expecting to see some examples of that. In the 3rd paragraph, we get to where the student starts to talk about the poem. We were talking about short stories in this class, how this poem, Jabberwocky, exemplifies the fantasy genre and talks about it's a made-up world, there are made-up creatures in it in this paragraph. Notice the citations. This is really nice. We're trying to kind of do some short answers here in this first section in particular. Notice how the student kind of pulls out just example phrases and then gives credit at the end of the sentence using that parenthetical reference. And keep in mind too, your parenthetical references typically will have page numbers in them when you're talking about the literature. This particular poem exists on the internet, so there aren't page numbers. If we wanted to get really specific, we would use paragraph numbers, or for poetry, line numbers, but we don't have to worry about that for this class because we have an actual textbook that has real page numbers. At the end of the answer, there is, and this goes on to a separate page, but it does not need to be on a separate page for your exam. There is a works cited section for each question, and that's really something that you should think about doing for each question. It's a lot easier for me as a grader. Think about other readers. Probably no one else will read your final exam for literature class, but if you reference it in the future in your academic career, you're going to want to be able to have those citations make sense. So as a reader, if I'm going through here and I want to figure out where this information came from, verify it, is this an academic source here? Where does this appear in the poem? I better go look. Then I can look on that works cited page. So we've got the Encyclopedia of Fantasy cited, we've got the poem cited, and then the information from the literature class on Blackboard. And I noticed there is an error here because these should be in alphabetical order, and Carol is definitely alphabetically before Clute in these citations. So just keep in mind some of those citation, just make it easy for yourself. Having the citations kind of after each question is going to help you separate the questions. So now this student who is in process with this exam is thinking, okay, I've answered one, I'm totally finished. I don't kind of have to go back and deal with any of that other stuff. Notice too that the example tells you that this student needs to answer some other genre because this portion, part 1 of the exam, asks you to look at 3 different genres, right? So that's a reminder. Let's check out part 2. In part 2, you should have 2 answers. They are asking you to define 2 of the following literary terms. So you'll have one question that defines one literary term and another question that defines another literary term. And in each question, you will use at least 2 or more of the stories we've read this semester to exemplify that literary element and explore how that literary element functions to help reveal the theme or themes of that story. Your choices for literary terms to define are conflict, dynamic characters, motif, symbol, and specifically the unreliable narrator. Right, so let's look at an example of part 2. You can see here that it's numbered question 4 because part 1 has 3 questions in it. And then it is pretty specific at the beginning that Samwise Gamgee is choosing to discuss point of view, which is not one of the choices that you have for defining a literary term. So the first paragraph, the student spends just defining what that literary term is and using, even though, again, this note sort of tells you that this is a paraphrase of the textbook. This is not the textbook you guys have. This class had a different textbook. There is still credit given to the ideas from that textbook. Because we've been talking about some of these literary terms in class, if you don't have to go back and look it up, then you don't have to go back and give credit to the textbook when you are looking at those. And so the first paragraph should kind of be defining that literary element. And then the next 2 paragraphs should talk about how the story exemplifies that and how that the literary element applies to the theme in the story. Keep in mind that this example only provides one story that exemplifies the literary term, and you are asked to find two stories that sort of show that literary term at play within them. And again, we have these like nicely integrated pieces of specific quotes from the story here. Now this is poetry, so there are slashes when we jump from line to line, but we don't do that with short stories. But it's really nicely done. We've got a context at the beginning to kind of incorporate the quote into the paragraph, and then we have an explanation of that quote. So it's really difficult sometimes for readers. It's very tempting for us as people who are analyzing literature to end paragraphs with direct quotes, but it's really difficult for readers to sometimes make connections between ideas and paragraphs in the larger essay if you don't kind of follow them up with that explanation at the end of the paragraph. And then again, after Sam answers this question, he has his works cited page to go on. And there's this reminder here that says, oh yes, I need to discuss another literary term to complete this part of the exam. All right, so let's check out part 3, the final part of the exam. This is the essay. In the essay, you will choose one of the following questions to answer, and you will notice that they are all compare and contrast essays. They're asking you to compare and contrast different genres. And we did some of this throughout the semester in discussion boards, or I may have even done it in lectures throughout our genre discussions. So feel free to go back to discussion boards and reference those. Feel free to go back to old papers if you did any kind of comparing and contrasting. What I'm really looking for from this essay section is something that looks akin to one of your response papers. And we did a number of compare and contrast response papers. And so the sample exam just gives you some organizational formats for a really nice compare and contrast. So our big kind of possible outlines for a compare and contrast paper are subject by subject, where you sort of separate your paper into your essay into one genre at a time. Now, this doesn't mean that one genre is one giant paragraph and the next genre is another giant paragraph. You should have sub paragraphs within that genre, but you sort of make these connections kind of in the middle of your paper. The other possible outline is a point by point, which discusses one aspect of each genre. So if you look at these possible outlines a little more closely, we kind of are looking for about each genre, the history of the genre, the characteristics of the genre, and an example story that illustrates the genre. And that example should sort of go back to what are you talking about regarding historical context? What are you talking about regarding those literary elements that exemplify that genre? And then there's a transition paragraph and a subject by subject. If we were looking at point by point, we would talk about the history of genre A, then the history of genre B, and make comparisons as we are sort of moving through those different qualities and aspects. And as Sam is moving through his essay, even though he's sort of just giving himself outlines, he reminds himself to have a works cited page. So if you are thinking about your paper, it's a lot easier to think about just doing it in like 6 different sections. Okay, I can tackle one section at a time. There's my works cited page, I'm finished. So you'll have 6 mini works cited pages. Notice too that this is in single-spaced format. Make sure that you use your usual MLA formatting, that it's double-spaced. It's a lot easier for me to provide feedback in that way. Also, please feel free to contact me if you have any questions or concerns. I'm happy to help you out. This is a lot of work. It's a culmination of everything you've learned from this semester, and I want you to do your best.